Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to go out of my way to review Season 2 of Cobra Kai. I am ultimately going to let you know how I felt about this show in a very cryptic-like sense, keep a double 5-time count, and then go into spoilers about this show. Ultimately, I'm going to go in and talk about this and ultimately tell you how I felt compared to the first season. Ultimately, we have a lot of reoccurring cast members, and then there's kind of some people kind of here plopped down to just kind of make the atmosphere of season 2 seem much more bigger. But anyways, let's go out of our way to talk about season 2 in a very cryptic like sense. Ultimately, if you did not know, there is also season 1. I'm going to playlist both of these things together to ultimately dare say let you know that you can go and onto the YouTube channel, see both playlists at any point in any time. So, Cobra Kai Season 2. Ultimately, very much in a cryptic-like sense, this movie does ride, I think, much more nostalgia than I think the first season does. The first season lives in nostalgia just because of realistically the very first Karate Kid movie. This really just goes in and kind of retroizes a lot of things, or having old dogs learning new tricks. While we go into this show, we ultimately have a very much kind of, at some points this is kind of deemed a almost fighting for real estate kind of season, much more so than the second season, or the first season, I mean. Like, the first season, it seems like there's kind of one, like, flow of the entire show where it seems like Cobra Kai, like, that is a big portion of the story, and kind of Lorenzo is just kind of appearing from time to time, kind of interjecting himself and this and that. Where in season 2, we definitely see Lorenzo a lot more, or LaRusso, I should say, not Lorenzo, LaRusso, my apologies. We see LaRusso a lot more, Ralph Macchio, we see him a lot more in the season. We ultimately have it to where, if you guys had seen the very end of season 1, ultimately you know that there is a big entity coming into this second season, and he seems to be very much like a real presence overall in this season. And realistically, he is not just something that is just going to appear at the end of season 1 just to ultimately be done away with fairly quickly. Going into this show, I ultimately felt that there was a lot of times when I could ultimately see kind of, they kind of did copy and paste from the first season, but kind of executed it a different way. They really did otherwise try to make this show for, I guess, a much more younger audience in this season, which I thought was kind of fairly odd. Maybe they realized, like, within the first season, they got back who was actually watching this show, and they probably maybe found out that it was a much younger audience, so they kind of tailored the show to a younger audience, I'm assuming, in this season. Or maybe that was just the way they were going to go regardless. Going into the show, I thought that this was a really great season 2. I really felt that it was good that we didn't have, like, there was some kind of clunky episodes, there was some kind of clunky situations. There really seems to be that, like, yeah, Cobra Kai seems to supposedly be the focus of the show, but it is very much now, like, fighting for real estate. Like, everybody is getting their hands all dirty in this episode. And like everybody's like having these tit for tat like moments and exchanges back and forth. And so ultimately it just makes for a fairly interesting show to how to almost be like if you guys remember the movie Revenge of the Nerds, where ultimately the jocks would do something to the nerds and then the nerds would go back to the jocks and vice versa throughout an entire movie. Kind of milk that out and kind of have it kind of be like placed within a season of them kind of doing that. Reasonably, there are sometimes within this show where I think there are some things that take a obscure backseat. It's just kind of like okay, and like thinking about it in actual real life measures, it's like would somebody be able to do not only like full time this, but also be able to because I guess I can kind of go out of my way to say it's Ralph or LaRusso ultimately decides to otherwise start teaching kids, and I'm just like, okay, how is he exactly going to balance pretty much being a full-time karate teacher and then also being a full-time dealership owner? I just don't quite understand how exactly he is managing all that, or if it's pretty much completely rested upon his wife. Really, how everything just you can eventually see how everything is just going to completely explode towards the end of the season. It kind of gives you with a real like big question leading into season 3 is where is everyone going to end up? Are people just not going to give up, or are they going to come back, or are is there going to be um, some tying into people that appeared in this season? Where exactly is Johnny LaRusso and everyone else down the line going to end up? How is Miguel going to end up? How is I think Jesse gonna end up? The Johnny's son, which I ultimately, even with 2 seasons, I still don't quite remember everyone's name. Um, where's LaRusso's daughter gonna end up after all of this? And this and that. Yeah. Like, especially where Johnny seems to, like, I really want to root for Johnny. I really want to root for Johnny in the show, but I just feel that his story, like, I don't know if I can trust that his story is going to have a happy ending. Like, I feel that eventually, like, he will just turn out just to be this guy that otherwise has to consistently trying to pick himself back together again. This guy is very much like Humpty Dumpty. And really it's just like putting back the pieces in every every single season. Yeah. In which I'll talk about that much more in spoiler version because I think I should do that. Break that down much more so. Reasonably, we have people that are trying to learn new things, whether it's Johnny in technology or Johnny and learning how to take his old teachings and shift them to a like how he wants to not be the bad guy anymore. How he basically tries to shift gears and realize that like the Cobra Kai is consistently the old Cobra Kai is a ghost that he can't shake. The old Cobra Kai is a monkey on his back just consistently, whether it's the memories or the um, just the dojo itself. And he has to figure out a way for him to fit. He has to figure out a way for him to fit in, but yeah, we'll see where exactly in spoiler terms that he goes into really going through the ringer in this season. Man, we have not exactly a we have a very much interesting way instead of actually doing an authentic actually we don't have an actual tournament to go into towards this season. If anything, that is kind of negated. There are several other things to go into in this season and this and that, and I don't think that that was a bad um, thing to not attempt at all, to not have a tournament. I don't think every season of the Cobra Kai show needs to have a tournament. I was completely and utterly okay with that. Um, I'm sure there probably are several probably karate tournaments, maybe, who knows, maybe once a month or once every couple of months or this and that. Um, but kind of deeming this show to not really have to have a tournament in this season, I was completely fine with that because ultimately I felt that if people were so strong-willed enough that they had to resolve things, that they were going to go by any means possible to ended up resolving their conflicts. We also have kind of a mixture of kind of new kind of side characters going into this show. And I'm kind of concerned about that because ultimately when they tend to add a lot of side characters into a show, I ultimately get a little concerned because I really kind of get concerned with that because a lot of times when it tends to have too many side characters that have too many important stories, I ultimately feel that that is when a show kind of reaches its highest peak, and then they kind of eventually just kind of don't know where to go past that point. And a lot of times the show ends up like either tanking or canceling or whatever. But like I think that this show has such a following that you have like really die-hard like karate fans or Karate Kid fans or just fans of the actors in general, that I think I wouldn't be too concerned about this show compared to a lot of others. I think probably for YouTube Red, this is probably its maybe flagship show, but I don't know. I could be completely wrong about that. But anyways, because I have heard that they are already thinking about doing a season 3 ultimately. To the second of this recording, yeah, I've heard buzz that there might be a season 3 to this. So I'm like, yeah, go ahead, do as many seasons as you'd like, because every season consistently wins me over. I enjoy every season that this show otherwise provides. So, yeah, going into this show, I I liked the fact that they kind of left every single or most of every single aspect of the Karate Kid movie, like kind of bringing back kind of some Karate Kid stuff. They kind of really did leave that in season 1. Season 2, they kind of barely do that, but realistically, a bulk of the time, it's really just um, kind of bringing back old ghosts and kind of, or not old ghosts, but kind of bring back some faces from either the the original movie, or bringing back some just, or putting in some new fresh faces, some very much comedic much more so kind of bringing a different kind of age range to this as well and this and that. But anyways, let's get into the spoilers of the show, because ultimately there's only so much I can talk about this in a very cryptic like sense, and I thought the show was still just a great way to overall go into this, and it was fairly enjoyable. It's great. So let's go into spoilers about season 2, because ultimately, yeah, I spent a huge hunk in time ultimately just really just going into this show in a very cryptic like sense. Let's get into this show in a spoiler like sense. So spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So ultimately, people that just want to hear what I have to say regardless, or ultimately have seen this show, ultimately I saw that it was actually trending on YouTube. I was like, wow, what a finally a great thing to ultimately see something trending other than like some game that I've been doing lately. It's nice to eventually see some kind of movie or some kind of show on YouTube that is actually trending. I guess it really helps that it's an actual YouTube show. If I did every single YouTube show just because it might be trending on YouTube, I don't know. I just don't think it would really work as, and I think that would just be me sabotaging or trying to just do something that would just get views. Maybe not a lot. Who knows? Anyways, because I'm just not that kind of way. I don't try to rig the system or whatever. So, spoiler time about season 2. Ultimately dragging this out. So, thought it out. Season 2. We ultimately have Johnny's coach that ultimately you saw in the very first season had destroyed Johnny's award that he had gotten for placing second in the tournament. We have him come back, and ultimately I'm like, okay, well, if Johnny isn't really seeming like the actual villain in this show, because you're supposed to root for Johnny, and Ralph Macchio is the also just a lovable character, that I'm like, who's going to be the villain in the show? There has to be a villain, and that has to be the original coach from the original movie. Ultimately, really throwing a lot of pipe wrenches into Johnny's teaching, ultimately kind of taking some kids and ultimately twisting and turning some of Johnny's teachings and having them being won over by the older sensei than Johnny himself. So, we go into this season, and ultimately, Johnny seems to otherwise be consistently either trying to copycat LaRusso or ultimately trying to one-up LaRusso. LaRusso in this show is ultimately trying as much as possible to get people to come and go to his Bonsai Miyagi teachings. Ultimately, the funny aspect about this is that I didn't quite like I realize this now once the show really does bring it up, really does poke a hole with this guy's teachings, is like you have it to where the Miyagi Dojo, ultimately you have it to where LaRusso's teachings is just, okay, sand the floor, paint the house, this and that. And a lot of guys are otherwise just like, oh yeah, that's how you sucker me in, and that's how you just kind of like, you tell me it's free karate lessons, but it's really just to paint your house and do your chores for you. I'm like, oh yeah, that is a real kind of interesting like breakdown of actually like having it to be like that Cobra Kai is so much more appealing. Because ultimately, people don't realize that the karate lessons are all within the chores. You have it to where you have it where the kid who was the, like, I would say, Hawk's friend, who ultimately had been very much like this nerdy kid who couldn't fit in with the Cobra Kai's because ultimately, like, he just had a lot of issues, kind of just doing a lot of their training, ultimately ends up with LaRusso, and ultimately it does make a lot of sense because his best friend Hawk has now turned on him and is ultimately just bullying him a lot of the times in this season. We have it to where we have seemingly almost quasi a love triangle going on, but then again, not quite. It seems like LaRusso's daughter and Johnny's biological son are ultimately getting closer and closer together. To the point to where they of course kiss one another, and they're kind of cementing if this should be a real legitimate thing or not. While Miguel is ultimately falling for one of the new recruits of Cobra Kai that end up showing up just around the same time, bizarrely, that the new sensei comes in, or the original sensei comes in and starts like kind of separating people and this and that. I would have honestly liked if this new girl that came in would have had some time to otherwise the original sensei, the original coach. Like, bizarrely, if they had been like working over these people this entire time, and this girl would have ended up just like telling Miguel somewhere down the line that she was just trying to like take him to the dark side or swerve him or try to get him on the side of the original sensei, which I'll just call Sensei because I just don't freaking remember his. I'm sorry, I don't remember his actual name in the show or anything. I'm drawing a blank. So we ultimately have Miguel's character, who is kind of very much playing the fence in this season. Like, you could see in the very first season that he was like this lovable guy that eventually, towards the very end of the show, he really just turned really like enraged and angry and much more of Johnny's character in the original Karate Kid movie, where it was like take no prisoners and this and that, and Johnny was just like, whoa, hey, yeah, I get it. You want to be a bad A, or you want to be a bad dude, let's just say. But eventually Johnny punishes his students for taking the easy way out by ultimately hurting a competitor, kind of really making these kids eventually realize it's like, hey, this is not life and death. Like, but the sensei from the original movie is ultimately kind of going like, hey, this, like, we're always in a battle, we're always in a war. Like, this is life or death. There is no second place. We do not lose. And so, seemingly, Johnny is really finding the sensei, and he just kind of magically appears and mentions that he, after the karate dojo didn't work out, he ultimately re-enlisted, and that ultimately he went through a couple different kind of bouts of military, and then he eventually just kind of just landed him here, back to realizing that Cobra Kai was back on the map. Eventually, Johnny eventually goes into like going like, okay, this guy is trying to win me over. He's gonna let me kind of take the reins, and just kind of be a side saddle, kind of assistant coach. But all the while, when Johnny has to leave for one reason or another, the sensei kind of takes over and makes people fight to the death, the Cobra Kai members, to where ultimately, when they're down, he wants them to, in a Mortal Kombat sense, finish the person that they're fighting. Which, like Miguel during these times, ultimately is just like, whoa, like this is not like life or death. Like, hey, like no, like she just got a point. He's down. That's it. So Miguel kind of is consistently playing the fence. He is, at times he is the villain, but then there are some cracks in that villain ego, and ultimately he is consistently throughout this season playing the fence because Johnny is being his conscience in this season. Um, Johnny kind of saw where his life had ended, and so reasonably he is trying to not have his past be his student's future, where ultimately he is just gonna live in a drunken stupor somewhere. And that's where he like ended up in the very first season, just consistently at a bottom of a beer bottle, and that's all that mattered to him until he just eventually couldn't take it anymore, and he just decided to just for one night live in nostalgia, and that led him to Cobra Kai. Ultimately, you have so much time with Johnny and Miguel to where Johnny is really so much more at first. Like the very first season of Johnny and Miguel, it was very much student and teacher, where ultimately Johnny was consistently treating Miguel like crap. But then all the teachings were to make this kid stronger. Where in this second season, Miguel and Johnny feel much more like equals, and it feels like they have very much a back and forth of like when Miguel goes to Johnny and ultimately tells him it's like, hey, I don't trust this new sensei. Like I think some of his teachings are just kind of too um, like just not right, and some of the things that he says just doesn't match up. To where Johnny ultimately takes Miguel for his word, and he's just like, oh, okay, hey, like I got this. Like now that you're telling me this, like I'm going to investigate. And surefire enough, he does, to eventually find that the sensei is just really just kind of dumped into some kind of home somewhere, where he's just kind of been just shuffling around because he couldn't actually re-enlist. Evidently, he had some post-traumatic trouble, and so no one would enlist him. So we get to the point where Johnny has to consistently feel sympathetic for his old sensei, even though in all actuality, this guy choked him out. His original sensei choked him out and was going to kill him. Really, when we have it to where also the Cobra Kai and the Miyagi Dojo ultimately are consistently butting heads about one another. It is so bizarre. Realistically, the Cobra Kai really comes down to Hawk a lot of the times. that Hawk feels some kind of bizarrish, like, he has it to where it's like, oh, the bonsai guys and the Cobra Kai, they can't be in the same room together. Hawk really, you give much more backstory of Hawk and how really damaged he was, kind of leading up to eventually him deciding to otherwise be this, I guess you could ultimately say, villain of this show, because everybody else is kind of playing the fence, besides the original Sensei and Hawk. And then everybody else is just kind of like, kind of having to choose their side and this and that, when eventually it gets down to the point to where we have it to where there's like this fun little contest and these funny little tasks that Johnny has these people do, like try to go inside a cement mixer and try to rotate the cement mixer, which I thought was like, man, this is kind of a crazy task for these people to do. But okay, I guess it's some kind of kind of teamwork exercise, which ultimately I could get behind. But yeah, like that seemed like a very odd task to have all these kids do, and this and that. Eventually, we get to where also Johnny has them do like this, capture the bandana like contest between like two different sides of Cobra Kai. And you have it to where the sensei is coming in and just kind of going like, whichever side you're on, like, that is your side. And it's just like, man, it seems like a lot of times like this sensei is not only like, there's a point when realistically, like, Cobra Kai, they go into that Cobra Kai, like, everyone with Cobra Kai is all like one entity, like they're all like one group. And then also, like, bizarrely there shortly after, they ultimately have to where the Cobra Kai teammates, an episode later, separate and have to fight against one another. So it's kind of very murky to where ultimately it's like they try to say that they're all one entity together, but then they have to separate themselves and fight to the death, and they're out for themselves. I'm like, this is kind of a little confusing and a little murky. We ultimately have to, or eventually, like I said, there's a very much love triangle going on. Miguel wants to get back with LaRusso's daughter, and ultimately because they have these like kind of like messages in the kind of the teachings where it's like, you have to be all in, or you have to give it your all, or this and that. And so Miguel is pondering about going in to be back with LaRusso's daughter, but then eventually he sees that this new girl is ultimately just like, well, I'm here. Like, I'm right here. Like, how about we just, like, give this a go? And ultimately you just kind of, like, forget about this whole, like, LaRusso girl. And realistically, I think Miguel just kind of gives into this just because it's easy. Just because it's, like, right there. And he falls into this trap of being this vicious person, and then you get Johnny right behind him that it's like looking at him and watching him like just do his thing, and then he's ultimately just like, yeah, I don't really like this Miguel. But then Miguel eventually turns around, and then eventually, once we find out that supposedly that LaRusso's dojo had been raided, and the Medal of Honor is gone from Mr. Miyagi's award trophy thing. We're just like, oh man, they really had to like viciously take something from like Mr. Miyagi. I know it's probably just not like a really like the hey, the guy's passed, the guy is like, yeah, but it's like shouldn't be taking it from like, I guess that was like the real like strong way to ultimately cement that like the LaRussos ultimately should have a kind of confronting of these people. But when it all comes down to it, it seems like just kind of LaRusso bursts into the dojo and ultimately doesn't really seem to quite have all of his facts straight exactly. It's just like, hey, yeah, like he should have actually said that somebody spray painted on my car Cobra Kai's don't die. He ultimately should have like had shown evidence showcasing exactly like what had happened. Instead, it just kind of he comes in there kind of half cocked, pointing a finger at Johnny, and he's just like, I don't even know what you're talking about. But ultimately, Johnny went out of his way to just try and find his son to finally actually start to be able to speak with him, but he kind of does it in a very caveman-esque like way. He ultimately doesn't really like, he doesn't like wait around for his son to eventually just come into work once he finds that he knows where he's worked. No, he just like grabs somebody and just ah rah 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 just starts barking orders at somebody to give him his son. And it doesn't work that way. It's like, yeah, your son is not here. Tough crap. It's like, so we have it to where it's Johnny and LaRusso are seemingly always going to be at odds. But in this season, it's much more so that both of the dojos are at odds with one another, much more so than Johnny and LaRusso are, to where eventually it comes down to a simple party that, of course, once you get young kids or young teens or whatever, and they all start drinking and everything like that, eventually it's just going to lead to maybe dumb decisions or ultimately just kind of backpedaling for some characters. We ultimately have LaRusso's daughter, who's ultimately just kind of very much going after Miguel's new girlfriend, just not liking her. And it's just like, well, why not just be happy that Miguel has somebody in his life? Like Miguel didn't really like go after LaRusso's boyfriend, and so why is it that like this girl needs to go after Miguel's new girlfriend? It doesn't quite make sense. But I guess since you could also say it's like, well, like they seem to just consistently just rub one another the wrong way. It just seems like they were like this was going to eventually escalate somewhere. But eventually we have it to where Miguel finds out that Hawk had the Purple Heart, eventually uh, sends it to LaRusso's home, but the boyfriend was at the home, and because ultimately he lives there now. Because ultimately Johnny's son like didn't have a mother. His mother basically, if she hadn't been bailing on him before, now she's almost non-existent. So this guy is just kind of just whatever he can just scrape together. Um, to where LaRusso ultimately has to knock on the door, and Ralph Macchio and ultimately come in and ultimately say, hey, like, how's your life going? Like, are you where's your mom? Are you here home? Kind of really just kind of like having this guy be their quasi like, hey, like come to our home, like, hey, like, you working with our family, and we're just gonna kind of take care of you, you old scamp. So we eventually have this entire thing where there is consistently just this dishonesty between a lot of people. There, a lot of times they're not quite being exactly honest until a lot of times it's too late. To where eventually we have it to where Johnny is seeming to really figure out exactly what girlfriend he wants. There's a whole thing about him going into a dating app and him trying to like figure out how to use a computer and how to put in Wi-Fi. And good for him. Good for Johnny. We also have a really great, interesting story where Johnny meets the original Cobra Kai characters from the original Karate Kid movie, and they ultimately hang out with one another because it seems like one of the members is seemingly very ill and seemingly just kind of like, yeah, I don't know how much longer he, sadly enough. But yeah, it is kind of a really nice refresher of having the original Cobra Kai guys there. Ultimately, if not to just kind of just have one last hurrah, which ultimately have a bar fight, which I was kind of like, oh yeah, good, this is awesome. Like, it's great to ultimately see that ultimately, yeah, a lot of these guys probably haven't like put on a gi in who knows how long, but uh, or I'm sure a lot of the guys probably do still have like they still have the stuff. We even have one of the guys who is ultimately the pastor in this show. Ultimately, he is a relative of Steve McQueen. So yeah, ultimately knowing full well that he is has a plethora of different kind of things to have on his portfolio and this and that, and resume and this and that. But anyways, we we go into this and we have again this time where Johnny's away. Ultimately, the original sensei will play. Ultimately, kind of twisting and turning and manipulating all of these kids to ultimately go for broke, go for death, like go for absolutely no mercy, to where Johnny has to pull back and ultimately say, you know what? All of these things here, all of the things that I taught you, strike first, strike fast, and no mercy, ultimately these are all just like black and white things on a wall. Ultimately, these are just to instill confidence in you. They're trying to make you a bad dude, a bad, like a very like confident person, but it also is driving people into consistently just wanting to fight and fight all the time. Even if it's not a beer challenge or a beer argument or like simply going out and trying to skate and eventually they have kind of a throwback 80s night at this like roller rink or whatever, or this dance or wherever it was, and eventually to where like it gets to where Miguel's girl and the LaRusso's girl are consistently just they're just gonna consistently beat the crap out of one another. To where even at this party they have this drinking contest with one another, to where ultimately the Russo's daughter is ultimately going to start having a big issue because she is like, whoa, I wasn't expecting to get this drunk at this party. and so ultimately, Johnny's son ultimately has to come in there and ultimately be the kind of consciousness, or the kind of like, hey, maybe you should pull back a little. Hey, maybe you should, like, he is such a good guy in this, like, in this season. He is trying to do 90% of the time, he is trying to do the ultimate right thing. Um, he is trying not to take handouts. He's trying not to, like, a lot of times I think a lot of stuff he is just ultimately just not trying to screw up, or he's ultimately trying to not lose something, or this and that. And so ultimately we eventually have to go into the big enchilada, the big old fight out, because we've been 45 minutes into this. The big enchilada fight out, we have it to where Miguel and LaRusso's daughter both kiss, to where ultimately Miguel's girlfriend in the background sees said kiss, and ultimately she's just like, ah. So the very next day, we have school starting, and everybody's just like, hey, I got your lunch, and I got your this, and I got your school, and I got your papers, and I got your backpack, and here you go. Ultimately having all of these kids going to school, have eventually Miguel's girlfriend bust out the intercom and saying, like, LaRusso, I'm coming for you. Two girls just going into school and just fighting it out, to all of a sudden, like, Miguel and Johnny's son are just kind of running to eventually get to these girls, knowing full well that it's like, what the heck is going on? Ultimately mentioning that Miguel had kissed LaRusso's daughter, and then Miguel and Johnny's son both fight. And then it just comes into this big, huge, gigantic fight out between everyone from LaRusso's dojo and Cobra Kai are all just fighting it all out. We get all these people that have went through all of these journeys, and they're all just decking who their counterpart is from this season that they were at odds with. And it gets to the point of, like, you're just seeing them going up and down through all of this school. It goes and having, like, to where Miguel's girlfriend is ultimately even putting, like, some kind of, like, some kind of even much more, like, durable thing on her hand to ultimately supposedly slice up LaRusso's daughter. And I'm just like, okay, sure. I don't buy that this thing is really gonna really hurt somebody, but I guess it is what it is. I guess it's almost an equivalent to brass knuckles, but not really. But anyways, we get to where is the main focus. If there isn't a bunch of freaking fighting going on, the fight between Hawk and his old best friend, ultimately knowing that both of these people are completely at odds, and eventually that his old friend is going to fight back. Now finally cementing that he can, like, once push comes to shove, he can really fight. But it just takes a while a lot of the times, and he gets hit a lot, because this kid, like, for an entire season seemingly had to learn to fight, and he's always the one kid that consistently gets punched in the stomach or in the face or something like that. And then eventually he's like, oh, whoa, time out. And he's like, hey, like, yeah, my legs hurt, my arms hurt, and I don't think I can do anything, and I have a doctor's note, and this and that. And I'm like, and LaRusso is just like, God, you are the most challenging student to teach. But he keeps trying to teach him regardless, because he, like he knows that he just can't give up on any of his students. So we ultimately have it to where the real fight out is between the love triangle, or in terms, a love square, because we have LaRusso's daughter, Johnny's son, Miguel, and Miguel's girlfriend. Ultimately, yeah, just they're all fighting it out consistently. It gets to the point where Miguel eventually freaking holds Johnny's son down, and he realizes that, like, show mercy. Ultimately leading for Johnny's son to ultimately just start beating the crap out of Miguel again. The only problem is Miguel falls and falls right into these stairs. I'm like, oh my god, is this kid paralyzed? Like, I'm assuming he's not going to be dead. I'm assuming he's probably going to be paralyzed and he's going to have like a comeback trail going into the next season. Like, I would not assume that this guy is going to be dead. If he is, then where does that leave? Where does that leave so many of these characters? Like, I would assume since when Johnny goes back into Cobra Kai, how Cobra Kai just basically disowns him, and I'm assuming that LaRusso is going to disown Johnny's son. Does that just leave Johnny and Johnny's son basically just having to be like LaRusso was in season one, where ultimately he is just going to go and just go, you know what, F it. Like, I am just going to teach my son to do karate, and then ultimately, if that leads me to coinciding with with LaRusso's tent, then great. But I just don't feel that Johnny is just going to quickly give in to just joining up with LaRusso. I think these guys butt heads way too much, and something so easily simple just completely makes these people have to fight one another, or they're just consistently at odds. To where I really have to question, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Added to where Johnny and LaRusso were going to legitimately fight one another. It seemed like they were actually going to legitimately fight. But I guess maybe that was put on hold because instead they wanted to do this the right way and ultimately have LaRusso put together a team to go up against Cobra Kai and eventually lead up to seemingly still at the end of the show we have Johnny and LaRusso fighting, mimicking exactly what they did from the first film, and like shot for shot, I think was kind of a very interesting way about going about doing this. Anyways, you have it to where Cobra Kai is under new management. Johnny is left to just drink himself to oblivion, and LaRusso is deciding to throw in the towel on karate. Daniel is ultimately realizing that this was a mistake to ultimately have his kid fight again, because ultimately that leads into someone's almost death. And LaRusso can take maybe some of the blame of this kid's near death because ultimately he was too much into his head about getting rid of Cobra Kai, but then eventually he has to realize that Cobra Kai is not the enemy. Cobra Kai can be easily turned and swayed to ultimately be retrained or relearned or kind of refigure into being good, upstanding karate fighters. It's just the fact that the way that they're programmed isn't exactly correct, because we have to relent in the story of past story of one of the Karate Kids. I believe it's probably, I'm assuming, the second one, where we have to mention that Russo was a Cobra Kai seemingly at some point, just to continue to keep fighting. And eventually how much of a mistake that was, and it's very interesting to have that really play out in the story, and I thought that that was very vital to the story. I was like, well, thank God they actually did that in one of the movies. Like, thank God that they actually found a way to ultimately have that in this story, and just kind of have a real actual like showcasing of Daniel's past to relate to his future story. I like how it seems like they're really trying as much as possible to relate the this current product with the films. I really enjoy that. I really like that. I'm just kind of curious how exactly they're going to relate any of these other things with any of the other Karate Kid movies, or like how are they going to relate the third one? I think they tried to barely kind of relate the third one into this season, which I thought was kind of fun. But I'm just kind of like, I'm assuming they're not going to relate the next Karate Kid. It's not like they're going to have that tied into here, because that wouldn't really make sense. That's not Ralph Macchio's story. And ultimately, yeah, I'm just kind of curious to see exactly where like all this is going. There's a huge amount of cliffhangers going into this season, and I was just like, oh my god, like this is a much bigger cliffhanger than in the first season. Like the first season, they have a good like ending to where it's like, okay, if you just watch the first season, like you'll be fine. But now, like they kind of get you hooked to the third season to see, hey, where is everybody going? How is everybody gonna end up? Is everybody just gonna be because everything kind of ends how like you could almost watch season one and like watch that all over again, and it kind of like is a perfect circle, because everybody kind of ends where like the first season starts. Like everybody has like thrown everything away that they've built through this entire time, to where everybody is exactly where they're at, where the pilot was, and with the loss of certain characters here and there, or certain characters kind of going a different way, or this and that. But yeah, overall, interesting season. I really enjoyed it. So I'm going to get out of my way to get out of here, because I ultimately have almost talked for an hour. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.